This video made possible by the Global Innovation Exchange. Visit gixnetwork.org to learn more.
Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we're honored to have you here today with us in Seattle. You're both co-founders, entrepreneurs in your own right, as well as investors. So with that, I'd love to kick it off with a discussion on everyone's favorite topic right now, AI. So Aileen, will you share with us what you're seeing in the AI market?
Sure. So I'm fortunate to actually, our first kind of AI-driven software investment is a company in Seattle called Textio, which we're very fortunate that I think GeekWire has written some interesting, really good pieces on Textio, so you can get a kind of a breakdown on what they do. But that was really my first exposure to software that Kieran Snyder, the co-founder and CEO, would describe as learning loop software, where you basically, you have to basically figure out how to get a proprietary data set to train off of, and then use a combination of, in our case, NLP and machine learning, and so kind of those things bundled together, I guess, are what we would consider AI software. But I do think AI as it's kind of a very vague term. So we prefer to use learning loop because it actually makes more sense in terms of how it actually works, right? Where the software actually is not rules based, but it actually gets better and learns without rules over time, based on basically the data and the actions and the inputs of the users.
And Joanne, you talk a lot about how these data sets, especially in startups, how do you make sure that those data sets don't have inherent assumptions in them or inherent bias in them? How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good question. I've been thinking about and being exposed to AI for a very long time. The funny thing is, this is probably the third season of where AI is popular, right? We've had 2 winters in the past. My father actually studied what he calls optimization many years ago at the University of Montreal, and that was AI, but that was like not sexy, not interesting, very hard to make money off. I think this is the first time where the technology is cheap enough to commercialize, right? And that's because of all the changes in hardware and the kind of data sets that we have. And I'm super excited. And we've been investing in mostly B2B AI-driven companies for a while. But going back to your question around biases, I think it's a nascent field in the sense that there's a lot that we haven't thought about. We are the parents of this technology. I think founders and the large companies are the parents of how we decide to use this technology. One of the challenges is that artificial intelligence does not recognize bias. It only tells us what the world already knows.
It can learn from biased behavior.
That's right. And so for one example of that is if you take all the images of computer science professors from Google Images and trains an AI, and you ask the AI, is this woman a computer science professor? The AI will tell you no. Most likely, she's not, right? And that's not something that will get corrected unless we are the ones that take steps into correcting that.
So how do we do that? What do you think is the future of AI bright and interesting and enabler to humanity, or is it actually quite dark?
I'm optimistic. As VCs, we have to be optimistic, right? Otherwise it'll be really, really difficult. But I think there's 2 aspects of this. One is thinking about the kind of training data that someone uses to make sure that there's levers to deal with bias, right? So in this particular case, to adjust kind of how this AI interprets that data set and say, hey, maybe that shouldn't be the right output. The other part of it, which I think is a more nuanced way of thinking, is if you think about people who are working in AI today, let's just use a hearing aid example, right? If you're developing a self-learning hearing aid for a specific population, let's say for the elderly, that means in the next 5 years, this product will get better and better and better for the elderly population, but not for anyone else, because this is a self-learning technology. It's going to get exponentially better with a lot of more data, which means in 5 years, the rest of the population will not have access to a product that is going to be useful for them.
Right.
Because the way that they may not hear is different from the elderly population. Right? So there's another angle, which is like we need to get people who identify with other problems to work on these kind of solutions so that the whole entire world has access to AI-driven products in the next 5 years. I think these kind of problems are not going to surface themselves today, but they will be detrimental if we don't solve for them correctly in the next decade.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Aileen.
I mean, I do think, joking aside, taking out instances like that example of computer science professors is a great one, but there are a lot of more rudimentary applications of AI that may not actually, we obviously have to be very vigilant about this, but there's just lots of rote, repetitive behaviors that people in businesses or consumers have to do over and over again, where the software is not learning that, like, whenever I log into this software, I always go to this tab, I always do this pull down,
right.
always enter this information, or computer vision, right, where it's like I'm looking at a piece of paper and I'm typing what I see in the paper into a software package. Like, that is a great application for AI that hopefully will not introduce bias into it, but it will free humans up to actually use their brains and have to stop doing repetitive tasks over and over again. And I think that's a lot of the applications in enterprise kind of AI for the next couple of years will be those kinds of tasks. It's like taking things that people do over and over again, where there actually is an underlying data set that can be learned from, where the computer can do the thinking for something that doesn't actually leverage a human brain. And I think when we think about markets, and they're usually for any venture, their go-to-market is almost always challenging, right? You have to convince a buyer who's using an existing software package or has existing business practices, like, why should you switch to this new thing? And I think for the past decade, a lot of it has been because of cloud enables a lot of new functionality or flexibility, and mobile. Right? And so, but that's kind of a decade-old trend. And so what's the new reason why? I do think that kind of AI and machine learning or learning loop software is the reason why enterprises will actually consider buying new software, or consumers will consider buying new products, because it frees up my time, because the software is actually smart and learns and has a learning loop in it. And that basically will create new productivity and new opportunities for humans to do different things with their time.
And what applications would you love to see from an enterprise perspective?
I mean, we're, a couple of our portfolio companies here in Seattle, one helps people basically do sales tax. It's called LumaTax, right? Where there's just a lot of calculations where you have to look up information in different places, because different provinces or different counties or different states have different filing requirements or different laws. Like, that is not a great use of a human to actually look up all that stuff manually and do it. Like, that should be in software. Fullcast, actually, I think one of the founders is here, which is basically kind of sales ops software. So I think there's a lot of vertical software where you've got humans doing a lot of repetitive or like memorizing a lot of information that sits in disparate places. Like, I think there's just in pretty much, like, my partner Ted talks about him. He's trying to position himself as the unsexy VC, because we're developing a specialty in what we call unsexy software. Like, there's a lot of software in back office processes and business processes that customers don't see that I think has tons of opportunity for improvement in software.
Yeah, and I think on our end, one of the companies that I love talking about is one called Maya, which we invested in relatively recently. And what they're doing is they are automating a lot of recruiting processes for blue-collar, high-volume, high-frequency recruiting. So if you think about Nike hires 10,000 retail store associates per year. Amazon hires 100,000 non kind of white collar workers per year, and recruiting.
And pays them more now.
Huh?
And pays them more.
It's
Yeah,
about to be a lot more now, and that the process of recruiting is very repetitive. So Adecco, one of the largest staffing agencies in the world, makes about $20 billion in revenues using people to do this, right? 20-minute phone calls, like, when are you free? What are your skills? Can you work with this client? So Maya is able to automate 75% of that using a conversational AI interface, and they're working with over 100 enterprises today. But I think the opportunity around the applications of automating existing workflows and also creating new services in the future is massive, right? Mm-hmm. We've made so much money and created so much value just getting workflow-based solutions, right? Salesforce and NetSuite and all these are just organizing human behaviors and making it slightly more efficient This is trillions and trillions of dollars of value. Now imagine if you can start automating so much of that. I think the opportunity is much bigger.
What do you think, Sheila? You've been looking at AI-driven software.
We spend a lot of time on AI as well, and are super bullish, as you two are, on how you think about kind of transforming the enterprise and what is human-capable work, and kind of how do you take that to the next level. We often see a tension, though, in enterprise between kind of data governance and those whose job it is to protect and keep the data secure versus the people that need to really use the data for new business processes and new learning and things of that nature. So that's something we've been spending some time on. We've also been looking at kind of invention from an AI perspective more globally. And I think that the investment that you're seeing in China in AI is actually really exciting. And a lot of our perspective on that is kind of that invention gets to be shared then globally. And so it's a nice thing when you have these kind of nation states that are saying, hey, we're going to take this computing paradigm to the next level. We're going to get there faster. We're going to make that kind of more exciting. And so I think that there's a lot to say about the positive future of AI.
I would say with China specifically, the issue of diversity and bias, solving for bias, is even more important, right? Because I think China will do a very good job developing AI technologies. The question is, will they start thinking through how they're going to train these products?
Right.
And who is going to benefit from these products over the next 10 years?
Right. So we have a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience. And what's the most impressive pitch you've seen from an entrepreneur recently, and why? Aileen, do you want to start?
It's not so recent, actually. But
That's okay.
I always think that one of the most memorable pitches we've been a part of is the Rent the Runway pitch. I worked at Kleiner Perkins at the time, and to be honest, two female co-founders with an idea about helping people rent dresses. Like, you can imagine, in most venture firms, that would go over like not so great.
A lead balloon, shall we say.
Because venture is a very male-dominated industry, and so usually when anything has to do with when the customer is clearly female, the answer is like, well, I have to check with my wife, or I have to check with my assistant. Like, would she buy this? And so it just doesn't go over well. But Jen and Jenny are such incredible storytellers, and they had so much vision, and yet they backed it up with so much data that for the first time, and I had probably been at Kleiner for maybe 8 years when they came in, and we decided to bring them to a full partner presentation. They got a standing ovation. That's the first and last time
from the
entire partnership. Like, the entire partnership of Kleiner Perkins stood up and clapped because it was so good.
Wow, Joanne.
A different angle to this, not maybe a success story from our end, but I think one of the advice that entrepreneurs get often is you got to get a warm introduction, right? And I think that's mostly true. However, this one time, many years ago, I did get a cold inbound, which I was very intrigued by. Someone had sent me a envelope with a pitch in the MarTech space. They used a Lumascape. I don't know if you guys have seen these Lumascapes of all the different logos on a paper. They had folded it into an envelope, and they had put a couple of very small slides in that to kind of get my attention. I was like, my goodness, this person is really, really persistent. And then I was followed up by a email, a LinkedIn request, and a request to just meet for 30 minutes. At that point, I was like, okay, I got to give this guy a chance. I mean, the persistence is uncanny. But we didn't end up making the investment. But I do think that there are certainly a lot of ways, if you're a first-time founder, if you don't have an in into a venture capital firm, and you still want to have the conversation because you think they're the right people to invest. We've been investing in MarTech for a very long time. As long as you have persistence and some creativity, you'll get that lead.
And Jamie, the founder of Ring, yesterday was talking about how he got turned down by a bunch of venture capitalists. And so what's your advice to entrepreneurs, when you're in the process of getting turned down, not once, twice, 3 times, but you're just getting turned down kind of by the venture community?
I mean, you don't have to make everyone want to invest in your company, right? You just need really one anchor. There are so many examples of companies that have been so successful. Ring is one of them. eBay is another. Pinterest is another, where the founders, went up and down Sand Hill Road and nobody got it. Obviously, lesson learned on the part of many, many venture capitalists that we're wrong most of the time. And so, I think that's part of the grit and resilience of entrepreneurs is
stick with it.
You got to, yeah. Listen to the signals that you're getting from people if they give you feedback on what's not going over great with your story. But if you have this fire in your belly and it's part of, I think, what helps entrepreneurs develop over time is, that perseverance. But it's not easy.
I would say that a lot of fundraising is similar to dating in the sense that there's a personal chemistry that needs to happen to some extent, right? And people are irrational creatures. Venture capitalists are not the exception to that rule. So some of it could just be because of a personal fit. The other thing to consider...
We can now title this session Irrational Dating.
irrational dating.
The GeekWire guys will use that.
The other thing to consider is that there's a lot of funding sources outside of venture.
Yes.
Right, that is massive, right, from governments, from individuals, from other businesses. And these are all great funding sources if venture is not the one to choose.
Yeah, I often tell people to white knuckle it out until it's so obvious that it's there, and then often they choose not even to raise venture. Right. So there's a lot of ways to go about all of these things. So let's say that you and you alone could name someone from the tech sector to the Supreme Court of the United States. We hear there's some open slots at this moment, an open slot.
She didn't give us these questions in advance.
So who would you pick and why? And either one of you. I know you're dying to go first.
Do you have an answer?
I do, but I'll let...
That was a good one. You should try and get her to say her answer first.
I know. I think you should start.
I'll kick it off. So it's a local hero. Most of you are probably familiar with Brad Smith. I think Brad Smith has done just an incredible job kind of leading a lot of... Give it up for Brad Smith. Just leading a lot of the topics that are apropos kind of to the nation, but also to the tech industry. So that would be, he's the president, he's the head of legal at Microsoft. So you can pick anyone you want.
I think if I look at the founders in our portfolio, I've always been very impressed by Reed, who runs Netflix. And the reason why I'm impressed by him is I believe that in order to be successful, either as a founder or anything in any other setting, you kind of have a very strong growth mindset. And over the last 20 years of Netflix evolution, the last CEO event we had, Reed was talking about how it was very difficult for him to grow as fast or even faster than where the company was growing. And the way that he did that was to read a lot of business books, a lot of things where he hasn't experienced, to talk to people who have experienced it. Without having to experience a situation, he was able to make good decisions, right? And I think that trait is so important. Someone going into the government in general and making all sorts of decisions for our country, it's very unlikely that they have necessarily encountered every single scenario and have thought about everything, but someone who has his kind of personality and skill to be able to learn quickly is important to me.
Okay, at first I was thinking, I don't know her, but everything I've read and heard about Ruth Porat is that she's very fair, thoughtful, data-driven, very experienced. Everywhere she's worked, she's very well respected. But then I thought, Kara Swisher.
Wow.
You know what? Let's not add,
Yeah.
I think that all the things she fights for and she stands up for people, she asks the hard questions. She calls it like it is. She calls BS on stuff. So I think my vote would be Kara Swisher.
Great answers. Great answers to a tough question. Where do you think we are from a macro perspective? And how do you think market cyclicality will affect private companies in kind of the era that we're in, kind of capital flush, lots of venture capitalists, capital coming from many different directions? How do you think market cyclicality might be different with private companies?
Let me say that again.
I think it's the best time to be an entrepreneur. I used to, prior to entering venture about 6 years ago, I used to invest in venture funds, and between then and now, it's just day and night. I don't think it has. I don't believe it'll get better. And
how do you characterize the differences?
Oh, just the number of founders that are in the ecosystem, right? It has never been easier to start a company because of cost, because of reduced barriers to entry.
We feel like Cloud City is part of that.
Oh, absolutely, right? The technologies you can use and all the services that these companies are providing. And at the same time, there's just so much capital because a lot of capital sources that were traditionally not venture or not focused on venture have recognized that venture is a great asset class in terms of making returns and have entered. Right? This is everything from mutual funds to international-based capital to former founders who have done a really good job and now are venture capitalists. Everyone wants to be a VC. But supply-demand, I think, is still in the favor of founders today.
What do you think is the future of venture, though, just as an add-on with that in mind?
The future of venture.
Very simple, short answer, I'm sure.
Sheila's great at asking tough questions. Well, so having seen, I used to also invest in private equity and hedge funds, and I think having seen the history of these asset classes, I believe that the first private equity firm, the first venture firms, the first black kind of firms actually captures a disproportional returns, right? When you invent something new, I think that's where ROI is highest. I think how venture was practiced 20 years ago is not how venture is practiced today. I don't think in 20 years the venture firms that will win are going to look like the venture firms today.
I hope not.
and these ladies can tell you more about starting new firms. But I think one of the differences is that venture used to value platform investors, right, end-to-end, everything from deal sourcing to adding board value. And if you look at the number of firms that are starting and innovating on that front, I think that skill set is getting more and more fragmented. People are really, really good at one or two or three things, but less so, everything across the board. So I think that's one thing. The second is, I think some of the learnings from operating, from running companies, whether it's used to leverage technology or data or automation or sales and marketing best practices, that's getting introduced to venture firms too. One of the things that you may be surprised by is venture firms are really bad at taking lessons from operating companies, right? Even though
yes,
those things have been proven out
yeah.
already. So I think that's the other part, which I think we'll see more and more of that. I think the third part is, if you look at my firm, we are a partnership of 10 people. Decision-making and internal processes are more complicated than when you have fewer people. So for us, we've been around for 23 years. We have to constantly think about how do you compete with new young entrants who can move fast, who are willing to take risks. And that means re-examining how we do things, how we create processes, how we think about decisions, et cetera. And that may be introducing more data or automated decision. That could be hiring a different set of people who bring more diversity. That may simply be let's have more partnership meetings so that companies can present, we can make decisions more quickly. But having a group of people who are willing to engage in those conversations, I think is really important.
I'm sure you're a big part of that positive change at Foundation.
Yes, definitely.
It's been fun.
And Aileen, do you think about, so as you think about the macro environment, and your perspective on the macro is either, it's too hot, it's not too hot, et cetera, do you change how you invest? Is it affected by that?
It has. So I differ a little bit, and I think it's always, being in technology is why we're all here. We all believe in it, obviously. It's such an incredible enabler and wealth creator and change agent. I do think it's a really hard time right now, both for investors and for founders, because there's so much money that it's really become this escalation game of war chest size. And I do not like that. I miss the days when it was not so much about the haves and have-nots, where if there's someone in your market that has $100 million in the bank, It just changes the dynamic. Whereas before, Series A's used to be $4 million, and like everybody kind of like could figure out how to raise $4 million, like the people who could figure out, and they were competing with each other, and they all had the same amount. Now, and you've also just got these humongous companies like Netflix and Salesforce and Microsoft and Google and Facebook that have a ton of money and can hire people for $500,000 or $1 million or $2 million a year. And so, it used to be that working at a big technology company was boring. And if you wanted to do something really exciting and innovative, you would work at a small company. So we had kind of had that going for us in terms of startup world. But now, like, you can work on pretty interesting stuff working at big tech companies, and you can make a lot of money working at Amazon. So I think that's harder for startups. So, someone told me yesterday there was a not GeekWire, but a publication that said that we're not going to write about your fundraising unless it's at least a $100 million fundraise. That's like ridiculous.
GeekWire can cover everything from 100 down. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, I feel like we're living in kind of like a messed up time from that perspective.
There's some SoftBank effect.
There's a ton of money. And I think it's causing a lot of people to waste money. It's obviously creating a lot of greed culture. And it's creating this race where people are willing to cut corners and trample over people.
And there's always the question of whether it actually builds better companies or not.
Yeah, exactly.
And
so
those outcomes and kind of really directly correlating to that is hard.
When you look at the history of when great companies that are sustainable are built, it's not during times like these. It's times that are tougher.
Right.
It's downturns. And so we've slowed our pace. And we've been advising our portfolio companies, yes, like I think we're not alone. A lot of venture firms have been telling their portfolio companies to go raise big rounds and keep your war chest dry, because something may happen, an adjustment may happen, multiples may contract, and you have to make sure that you can basically grow into the valuation that you raise at. So it's kind of like you can't sit it out. You have to participate and understand the context, but also the longer term context, that it may not be like this forever. And I think that will actually be a good time for founders and investors.
Right. Well, we believe that everybody's marching towards becoming a mythical creature, a unicorn, which is a term most of you probably know this, that was invented by Aileen. So we thought, it's GeekWire conference, they like to create news. We thought you could invent a new term.
Oh, just on the spot, because that happens.
Here for us today. And, take your time. But
does Sheila corn count?
Sheila corn does not count, but I like it. I'll use it. But
how'd you come up with unicorn?
It wasn't just like on a white couch.
It was a different colored couch. We can get you a different colored couch.
Well, I had a new fund, and I was trying to figure out if there were some rules to basically create some constraints around investing. So if should I be looking for people who dropped out of Stanford? Should I be looking for only 25-year-olds? Should we, and so I kind of interviewed different people who had great success and experience in venture and also LPs, and it just seemed like all the data was anecdotal. And that amazingly, for an industry that manages over like $300–400 billion, there was like no data. And so I just started creating a spreadsheet and making a list of companies that had become worth over $1 billion in the past 10 years, and just starting to create columns on. We didn't even have an Airtable back then, but
there's nothing that Excel
like, were they
can't
enterprise,
solve.
were they consumer, when were they started, how many founders were they, how did they know each other before, how old were they when they founded it, where did they work before, where did they go to college? Like, I wish I could have added birth order. That's one column I always wanted to fill in. And it just started going out now, like how much did they raise in their A, how long between the A and the B, how long between the B and the C, who did the A, like it was just tons and tons of data. And then I tried to like figure out what do they have in common. And there were a bunch of things that they had in common, and some of them I think were kind of like contrarian at the time, because at the time the hotness was like, if you haven't started your company by the time you're 30, you're like a loser. And I think that's the data showed, and I'm gladly that was wrong. That it helps to have work experience and to be in your 30s or 40s when you start a company. And so I kind of wrote up the findings, and I had this like placeholder for a sentence that was, public or private company that was less than 10 years old and worth over $1 billion. And I had so many times in the blog post that I needed to come up with a short word to fill it in.
Were there other candidates for that
I
word?
had, like home run, mega hit, and they just all sounded really boring. And then when I put in unicorn, it just made the whole thing read so much more easily, and it made it more fun. And also I think it added, I wanted to add this feeling of scarcity and alchemy. Like it doesn't happen very often, and it is really special.
Yeah.
And there is a thing about it, and so it kind of just made it all better. But so there you go. It took a long time.
Well, we're very thankful. We're very thankful for the name.
My high school is particularly thankful because our mascot is a unicorn.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And when you came up with this term, they're like, oh, this is awesome. It's a STEM school.
Is your high school now
awesome.
worth $1 billion?
It's now worth $1 billion.
Amazing.
What would we, if we were going to try and name something, what would we name? Something that had been worth $1 billion and then just is no longer?
Or something that's worth multiples of $1 billion?
Yeah.
That's depressing. That's
a failed unicorn? Yeah, I mean, in the environment that we're in, there's the decacorn, right? There's I think we called it, not a mega, did I call it a mega unicorn? Something's worth over $100 million? $100 billion?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, in this kind of inflationary universe that we live in, we probably need to come up with names for things that are even bigger.
Come up with a higher end.
Yeah, the trillicorn. Yeah.
Multiple corns. I like it. So you both spend a lot of time with your companies from an operational perspective. And a lot of people say that, and then it's not actually true. And where do you think companies actually need more operational attention? And you have a lot of demands on your time. How do you think about that operational engagement, where it's most effective?
I think for us, this is a relationship, again, going back to the data analogy, and it varies quite a bit company by company. For me, for first-time founders, I think there are a few milestones in the company's life cycle that they typically want more help. One is around fundraising. I remember for one of my companies that's doing really well now, they're doing probably around 100 million revenues today. Fundraising has been tough historically, so I spent probably 2 weeks full-time fundraising for the CEO, doing first meetings, meeting investors, telling the pitch, and then when an investor got super excited, then I would make that introduction, and then we raise.
So you did it on your own. That's unusual.
I did it on my own, but I think that.
And what was that decision process to do it on your own versus doing it with?
Because the CEO was already working on this, and he was not getting kind of the right conversions, right? He was getting fairly low conversions. And I think the reason for it was because he wasn't targeting maybe the right people or telling the story in the way that I was. And I thought this was an interesting experiment. He needed help here. I had a lot of time. This was many years ago, and so I decided to try that, and it worked really well. So that's one example of kind of a milestone where I think companies typically want more help.
It's a phenomenal example of value add.
Yeah, and then I think the other milestones are certainly closing candidates. I think that's always a challenge. I think in the beginning, customers, so we develop customer networks like CMOs and CISOs and CIOs and whatnot, and try to help really small companies get their first few customers. And I think more rarely, and because this happens at the very end, but the exit is always probably the most challenging part for people.
Yeah. All companies spend so much energy recruiting. And it's really inefficient, but I also think part of the reason why is because we need more talent development. I think people want to be great at their jobs. They want to be great at sales, or great at marketing, or great at UI, or great at whatever their job is in finance. And there isn't a lot for people by function to be the best marketing manager you can be, or like the best FP&A person you can be. And if we could give more professional development to people who want to be good at their jobs, then recruiting actually would be easier, so there'd be more good candidates.
Right.
It's so inefficient to spend all this time trying to find a needle in the haystack. Why don't we put more needles in the haystack? And I also think that's more important than ever because the Bay Area has gotten super expensive. It's gotten really hard to build technology companies in the Bay Area, I think, and so and obviously Seattle, the tech market is, I think, booming and will continue to grow, but also Denver and Austin and Salt Lake City and Park City and like all these different places and around the world there are going to be great technology companies and every company is going to be in some cases like a technology company. And so we just need a greater supply of people who can do those jobs in different cities and in different kinds of companies.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. So for the final question, we're so lucky to have you both here in Seattle. What's your advice for this city? You know, you're joining us from Silicon Valley, you're joining us from a different ecosystem. What should we be doing as a collective to help Seattle succeed?
So I grew up all around the world. I was born in China, I lived in Canada, I spent a lot of time in North Carolina where my parents live, and I invested in Chicago prior to Silicon Valley. And I think personally, I'm incredibly bullish on what you're talking about, which is I think talent is getting more and more dispersed. If I look at AI in particular and the talent around that, it's completely distributed. It's not focused entirely in Silicon Valley. One of the things that I notice about other geographies is that there is sometimes a lack of ego, right? Like, hey, you look at Silicon Valley, you guys must know better. You know, that's not true. I think embracing the unique advantages of a particular geography and shouting to yourselves and to the world and to the founder ecosystem that we're going to be, and we deserve to be the best, is a mentality that I think is necessary.
That's great, thank you.
I'm a big fan of the opportunity in Seattle, and I think both, obviously you've got some very large tech companies here, but also like a growing cadre of successful entrepreneurial companies. And I had the fortune of meeting the mayor of Seattle earlier at lunch, and she made a great point, I think, which is, you know, technology is obviously, so I would continue to nurture and success, like, and create poster children and like help Seattle and based companies be more successful, because that will continue to help the ecosystem thrive. But also, we have to make tech and tech-driven companies more equitable for women and people of color and people who are different, people who didn't go to Harvard and Stanford, people who didn't grow up with privilege. You know, we have this window, especially with what's going on in our country, where these issues, I think, are more like in our faces than ever, and it will be such a crime if we don't do something about it to actually permanently change the tech ecosystem to make it truly accessible to all kinds of people from different backgrounds and different perspectives.
You've had great leadership in this area. Is there a specific area you'd love to see Seattle step up? Or
I think if you're a founder, you have to, especially if you are the CEO or a founder, you have to be purposeful with who you hire and the culture that you build. You cannot assume that someone else is going to take care of it, and you can't assume that you are just going to fix it later. So whether it's like looking at who you are hiring and being willing to slow down, you know, sometimes you have to just hire, because you have to ship your product. But whenever you can, slow down and build new networks. Ask people who are not in your network to introduce you to people who are different so that you can hire outside of your network, hire people of color, hire women, hire people with different kinds of challenges or different backgrounds, and pay attention not just to the numbers of who you're hiring, but the culture and the quality of the conversations, who's going to lunch with whom, whether everyone in your company feels like they have an equal chance of being successful, regardless of what level or what function they're in, I think is really important.
Well, I've always loved the phrase that culture eats strategy every day of the week.
Yep.
And let's thank Joanne and Aileen for doing a
wonderful
job.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you so much for being here.